Fellow Toastmasters, at this time, I'd like to introduce Dave Berkheimer. Folks. Okay. I got that picture about 4 years ago after I moved down here. I found it in the Elks Club, in Little River. When I sent out my introduction, I talked about the commission report. Danny was in the front of the plane on American 11. He was 31 years old. He knew Arabic because he had moved back to the United States to go to MIT to grad school. Prior to that, his military service with the Israelis was in the same commando unit that had been involved years before that in the raid at Entebbe. I was living in Northern Virginia. I had left Mobile, was doing a business from my house. I went out for a run that morning. It was a beautiful morning. I got home from my run at 9:45. Went over to my computer. I needed to transfer some money from my Morgan Stanley account to my business account. I forget what I was going to use the money for. But Morgan Stanley website wouldn't come up. I didn't turn on the TV, listen to the radio, anything. So I called my Morgan Stanley guy in Northern Virginia and said, Al, what's wrong with your website? He said, Dave, our building's gone. Turn on the TV. So I did that. And all you see is, or all I hear is Boston, Boston, Boston. My son was living in Boston at the time. So I called him up on his cell phone, because that's all he ever used. And he was still at home. You know, he was working for a tech company, Akamai, the one that Danny Lewin founded. And he was, you know, like most tech guys back then, you know, he would leave the house at about 9 and go into the office. Well, he had turned the TV on about 9:15. He saw what happened, he was still there watching it. So I said, don't go into the office. He said, it's okay, well, I'll go into the office. He was living in an 800 square foot apartment at that time, very close to where the bar that Cheers was filmed at in downtown Boston. So we went to the office, and then I immediately started making phone calls to people I knew, who I knew were traveling or might be at the Pentagon. First call was to my brother. I'm a chemical engineer with an MBA in finance. Went to Bucknell, got my MBA at night at Drexel while I was working. He was at Bucknell 3 years behind me. He got his MBA at night at Lehigh because he was working for Air Products in Allentown. Well, he had flown the day before to New Orleans with a friend, or a fellow colleague. They were doing business there. They had a rental car. They were going to go to the airport in New Orleans and I think fly to Houston that day. Well, I got him, and he said, well, and by that time, planes had been grounded, so he ended up taking the rental car with his buddy and driving back to Pennsylvania from New Orleans. A lot of people ended up doing that. A lot of rental cars didn't get turned in where they were originally supposed to get turned in that day. Second call was to one of my golfing buddies who we had played golf that weekend. I knew he was going to be in a conference in Denver, and he was there a day before. He was there doing the preliminary setup the day before everybody else was going to come in. Everybody else was coming in on 9/11. So he was stuck there, the only guy at the conference. He ended up driving back from Denver. I then called a friend of mine who had done 27 years in the Air Force. And at this point, he left the Air Force, I guess it was late 1990, just as Desert Shield was becoming Desert Storm. And then he went on to, as many retired military, he went on to, especially if you're living in Northern Virginia, he went on to work for several government contractors. The office where they were was 5 or 10 miles from the Pentagon. Called him up, I got him, and he said, yeah, we were sitting here in the office, saw what was going on in New York, and as it was getting close to 9:30, somebody said, gee, I'm glad we're not at the Pentagon today. Boom! That's when the plane hit the Pentagon. And he was okay. I wasn't representing this air purification company at that time, but the company that I've been representing for 15 years that sells indoor air purification equipment donated hundreds of units to the Pentagon that day, and they worked extremely well. So I had made my phone calls, watched the TV, you figure I was going to have lunch with one of my mobile colleagues who was now working for Exxon. Called him up, hey man, we're evacuating. Because mobile building at that point was maybe 10 miles from the Pentagon, and there were still planes flying around. So didn't have that lunch to go to, and then I think it was about 2 o'clock, I get a call from my son, and he's devastated. What's wrong? Danny was on the plane. We all knew that he'd fight him. Well, the way people knew is the stewardess was on the phone in the back of the plane and said, a businessman has been killed. There's mace up in business class. I think we've been hijacked. That's not exactly what it says on page 5 in here. But a couple days ago, in preparing for this speech, I Googled Daniel Lewin 9/11. There's a very brief thing on there that's about a minute and a half, but there's several other videos. One of them was done about 10 years after 9/11. Some of his family members, his co-founder of the company Akamai, that he was a professor. He was Danny's professor at MIT, and I believe one of my son's professors as well. And some of his family members. He had 2 brothers who had stayed in Israel. Danny had met his wife in Israel. He had 2 kids. He left a legacy of a foundation of about $250 million. But he left some other things. I believe my son was one of those. What Danny wanted to do, he was a brilliant man. was he was really into technology and helping things work better. I didn't realize this at the time, but apparently in the late 90s, they were calling www the World Wide Wait, because it would take a long time for websites to load. Well, Akamai figured out a way to make that happen quickly. And the first real test of that technology was on 9/11, when all the news sites were flooded. And the ones that were using Akamai didn't go down. But what Danny really, his original objective was to teach and help people learn. On the day that Akamai went public, when my son was a junior, it was an IPO. It was the time when IPOs were hot. My son had the equivalent of 40,000 shares. The strike price was 26. That's a nice round number, $1 million. A little after 1 o'clock is when the first trade happened. It was 110. It ended the day at 170. It ended the year at 350. That was the peak. By 9/11, it was down to 5, and after 9/11, it went down further. But the company is still there, vibrant, and doing great things. They expanded beyond what they originally set out to do. My son stayed at Akamai for a few years, then went out to work for a real startup in San Francisco for a year that went nowhere. So about 14 years ago, he said, "Dad, I'm moving back to Boston. I'm either going to go back to Akamai, or if the right thing happens with Google, I think I'm going to work for Google." Well, the right thing was they bought YouTube. And my son became the top technical person at YouTube and was essentially in that role until he left YouTube in June of this year. In the meantime, he moved to San Francisco again. He met his wife in Boston before they moved. I have a little over 3-year-old granddaughter that was born in San Francisco. I think that's when they decided we're not going to stay here long term. There are other issues involved, like everybody else in the families on the East Coast, especially my daughter-in-law's parents. And so anyway, the reason I said I think my son is part of Danny's legacy is he is now the chief technology officer for an educational startup, very well-funded educational startup in Boston. They moved back there in January. He finished up working for Google a few months ago at Google's office. And the name of that startup is Better Lesson. It's a way to help teachers who've retired and have all their stuff in a file cabinet. Now it's not in a file cabinet. When I say very well funded, 2 of the companies who have invested in this company, and one is represented on the board, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Michael and I think Susan Dell Foundation. So that's my story. And thank you very much for listening. I'm a Rotarian. This was a dry run for me. I'm giving this talk tomorrow at the Little River Rotary Club at noon. They meet right on the border. I'm now in the Wilmington Club because I've got an office in Wilmington. But thank you very much.